Disasters are often painted as events that come out of nowhere, but most disasters are predicted. At least somebody predicts them. Disaster managers and researchers know what the biggest risks are and can imagine how they are going to play out. In part, this is because many people, as you might have noticed, are really good at imagining bad things happening in excruciating detail. But more importantly, there are also large numbers of people who study seismology, epidemiology, meteorology, sociology, and other fields that deal with risk and disaster. And it shows. Very often, a disaster has been imagined and modeled with striking accuracy way before it actually happens. Take the example of Hurricane Pam, a simulation exercise carried out in New Orleans about a year before Hurricane Katrina, and included most of the issues that the real storm would cause. Or a 2016 project by the Texas Tribune and ProPublica that predicted the devastation that would be caused by Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And you've got the 2018 Palu earthquake. It's true for pandemics too. Scientists have known for at least a century, since the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, about the risks of disease in a globalized world where a virus can leap from a village market to a metropolis on the other side of the world in days. The SARS and swine flu outbreaks reminded governments, non-governmental organizations, and corporations to update their planning for managing and surviving epidemics. The United States Department of Health and Human Services had a scenario and a series of exercises on a pandemic scenario earlier back in 2019. So, if we know what to worry about, why are so many countries seemingly so poorly prepared to deal with disasters? Well, the first important answer is that many of these predictions do help, especially in the countries that take them seriously. The experience learned from SARS, MERS, and the swine flu left East Asian countries in general much more capable of dealing with coronavirus. The Hurricane Pam simulation demonstrated an awareness of what a hurricane would do to New Orleans, but it also highlighted problem areas that officials hadn't considered, such as the difficulty of evacuating people who didn't own cars. These weren't completely ignored. The Senate report on Katrina found that although the plans being developed from the Hurricane Pam exercise weren't finished in time for Katrina, some officials took the initiative to use concepts developed in the draft, even though they had mixed success. The problem is not in knowing what to do, it's in doing it, and it's in the willingness to pay for it before it's too late. Mostly, as the Hurricane Katrina example shows, it's doing it in a timely fashion. Because while we know quite a lot about probable disasters, where they're going to happen, what they're going to do, whom they're going to affect the most, what we don't know is when. We predict disasters in poorly understood probabilities or vague ranges on the order of decades or even centuries, like a 500-year flood. That uncertainty has led decision makers to postpone disaster preparedness, which studies have shown to take a significant return on investment and save time and money during responses. Now, leaders can somewhat rationally hope that that a predicted disaster is going to hit in someone else's elected time in office and it's going to put their budgets towards more visible objectives. But it's not just money. For many disasters, effectively preparing means unpopular decisions, telling people that they can't build or live in floodplains or on the coast, that we've got to prioritize wetlands over industry, or we might have to restrict travel. An emergency manager from Japan, where oil from fuel tanks at the port caused an immensely destructive fire in the wake of the 2011 tsunami, said that not only had his jurisdiction ignored this risk, oil tanks continued to line the coast of Japan. Knowing how dangerous it was, the government was still reluctant to restrict that economic activity. This is nowhere more obvious than in the epitome of predicted disasters, which is climate change. We know what we need to do, or stop doing, to address the threat, but we keep pretending that it's not our problem, that it can be left for later, that someone else, whether in another country or another generation, can make those necessary changes and pay the costs, in dollars and in discomfort. One study shows that $1 spent on preparedness mitigates an average of $15 worth of damage later, but that voters will reward spending on disaster mitigation, not disaster preparedness. That's what happened with wave after wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. Even after seeing it happen elsewhere, even with the rational understanding that countries need to act before they felt the impact, there were still delays and reluctance. Our reluctance to believe in disasters is worsened by the way we treat each other, one, after the fact, as the only disaster. Government reports and media accounts alike are studded with words like unpredicted, unprecedented, and unimaginable. These reports supposedly have the purpose of learning from mistakes, and more rarely successes, to ensure that future disasters are handled more effectively. But like simulation exercises and probabilities, those carefully documented lessons are rarely given the funding or political attention to be put into practice. After a disaster, people are more likely to heave a sigh of relief and slide back into normalcy, forgetting those whose lives continue to be affected by the aftermath. And yet, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has found that general acceptance for disaster risk reduction and recovery planning peaks after the disaster. That's the brief window where we are convinced that devastating upheaval is possible and could happen to us. We know that disasters will happen. We even know how and where. Let's demand that our political leaders start putting that knowledge to good use.